Not doing it for praise, glory, or fame. We're not doing it so others will know our name.
But we have no choice in the South but to do what has to be done, however ambitious it might be. Beginning with the slave rebellions, the Civil War of 1861, the civil rights movements in the 50s and the 60s, the struggle for democracy in the South has been led by black people. Dr. King made a call for unity between labor and the struggle for democracy led by black people. And he made the call with his blood. He died, leaving the picket line in Memphis, Tennessee, standing with workers, supporting the right of workers to belong to unions. We believe that we are carrying forward that tradition, that when we fight, Dr. King continues to live, that when we fight, the people of the South will know that a paid holiday for Dr. King is important for democracy because it becomes a symbol of a person who was at the cutting edge of a movement that was fighting for democracy and rights for all people. The Black Workers for Justice, we are part of that same movement, but we are also a part of a labor movement. We believe that the trade union movement in this country is a small section of a larger labor movement. We are part of that labor movement, even though we're not a trade union. We're organizing workers at the workplace in small committees, fighting for rights on a job, fighting for a decent standing of living, linking the institutions that we frequent every day, the churches, the community-based organization, to that struggle. But in order for us to be able to go forward, to win democracy, power, and liberation in the South, then the balance of power for working people and the corporations in the South must change. We can't support our own candidates by wearing buttons on our jobs because we have no organization to protect us from being fired by bosses who don't support the candidates that we support. We can't fight for quality education and make that fight known on our job without fear of being fired because we have no organizations to defend ourselves on the job. If this balance of power is not changed by organizing workers on the job, then we can't advance beyond the level of the democratic struggle that Dr. King and others have led us to.
The visionary for the fruit of labor has been Abner Berry. Peace and blessings upon him. As you know, he was a founding member of the BWJ and also a person who had a wealth of experience, particularly on this cultural question. So Brother Abner tried to say that without a cultural component to our movement, to our organization, that we would not be able to somehow sustain the fighting spirit that we needed for this long, protracted struggle.
One way that Fruit of Labor is different from other singing groups is that we grew out of an organization, a mass organization, a movement that was going on here in the South, particularly in North Carolina, specifically in North Carolina. And we get our direction from that organization.
We're about ready to assemble for the area-wide mobilization for workers' rights and economic justice, the May Day March. We've had a couple of the leaders of the Sledge Lock Workers Committee to put forward the purpose of our May Day March here. We had one of our leaders, Nelson Mann. Sounds like Nelson Mandela to me. Right on, right on. Another one of our leaders, Janice Holder, and another one of our leaders, Molly Williams. All of the workers here are leaders. All of the workers belong to the Committee Against the Sledge Plant Closing. All of the workers have made sacrifices, and all of the workers are determined to win.
Sledge lock workers are taking a stand just like everyone else around the world, and it's very important. And you've learned some things that it takes students years to learn in school. You've learned it in the University of Class Struggle. You learned about the international connections of our economic system, about workers in Mexico.
The Women's Commission spent quite a bit of time too organizing plants that were majority women, and that took place in Rocky Mount. There was the Rocky Mount undergarment plant that they sewed and made underwear for Victoria's Secret, and we would go to the plant early in the morning because, you know, a worker came and said they were having problems, you know, whether it was around rage, but a lot of it was around sexual harassment. So what we did, we got up early, like to hit the first shift, you know, get there at 6, and we started passing out leaflets.
We find out as we are more consistent, then, you know, people have a greater response. People have come back and they've asked about leaflets. They come ready for us now.
All the South will never be the same. We as workers, we want fairness, and we're on the fairness campaign. We as workers, demand fairness.
Growing up in the South, you know, it's sort of like the plantation is still got to keep going because, you know, even today in 1991, you know, the workplaces is trying to treat the workers as though they're still in slavery.
The goal of the Workers' Want Fairness campaign is to build a broad-based labor movement in the South, to create a dynamic effort to support workers struggling on the shop floor to change their conditions, beginning to educate the whole community about the importance of trade unions.
Even when we're just a few, we can't be discouraged. We got to keep on keeping on, keep on organizing. We got to train ourselves. You know, we got to become the leaders of our people. I'm not talking about people who walk around with badges on their shoulder bragging about, you know, how much education they have or how well they think they can speak. I mean the true leaders, the one who love our people, the one who prepared to make the greatest sacrifices for our people, the one who prepared to burn the midnight oil, staying up all night, thinking and planning, you know, and encouraging each other to go forward. The leadership of our people, and that's what black workers have to do. You know, older black workers, younger black workers, women black workers, men black workers, you know, we all got to grow, develop ourselves, you know, have confidence in ourselves, organize ourselves so we can become the leaders of our people. And I think that we're going to realize the kind of goal of liberation and power that all human beings should be able to have if we just keep our eyes, you know, on the prize, just keep on going.
We're going to organize. Come on, let's organize. We're going to organize. We've got to organize. Not doing it for praise, glory, or fame. We're not doing it so others will know our name.
I ain't gonna let this system turn me around, ain't gonna let this system turn me around. We're gonna keep on walking and keep on talking until these workers are saved.
Good morning, and welcome to our 12th biannual Local 150 convention. And we also are here to celebrate 25 years of organizing here in North Carolina.
All right. Folks have always asked us, you know, what has this union achieved? There's no way I can sum up all of that in a quick 10, 15 minutes.
Over the last 25 years, UE Local 150 has pushed back against our bosses and the government with public speakouts, press conferences, and demanding and receiving meet and confers. In the last 2 years, we have newly won meet and confers in with the city managers in the 3 major cities, Charlotte, Greensboro, and Durham.
We were unified, we were together, we were strong. We shut down the street on several occasions. And the result of that was the wins that we just received. Those 20% increases, the 2.5% for CDLs, I mean, all the things that we needed, we got.
We've had a really successful run at CRH, and I think it was Bastille Day, July 2021. Dante, David Bartholomew and I are out there recruiting members, and I think we signed up about almost 50 members that day.
And so going forward, I think the kind of goal is going to be to really look at that kind of pay increase across the board for campus worker and for graduate workers, and ending the pay to work policies that the UNC system has initiated.
We've been able to accomplish a lot of things at Rocky Mountain Energy Plant, and one of the reasons, like I said, is our union news that informs our employees of what's on the table and what the company is and not doing.
This is not any convention. This is a UE 150 convention. And I call it the feistiest, fiercest, and most focused union here in the South.
I hope that we all can just get this information into all of our members' hands. We can give them hard Medicare for all as something that we all need to fight for.
We're talking about reallocating money from these big, huge, swollen police budgets and putting it back into the things and the people that make us safe. That's y'all.
Poor quality of housing can cause disease and injury, affect a child's development, while other housing-related factors such as neighborhood environment, overcrowding could lead to mental health issues, physical health problems.
Roe v. Wade has been overturned, and now it's our turn to shift our votes, raise the volume on our voices, and create the type of good trouble that I live for.
I'm going everywhere I can go. Will you go as well? Will you organize as well? Will you organize as well? Because the stone that the builder rejected have now got the possibility of being the chief cornerstone of a brand new democracy, and it's high time we act like it.
So as we commemorate our 25-year anniversary of organization building workers' power here in North Carolina, we must know our rights and not be afraid to stand up and fight for what's fair.
Through a major crisis, social, economic, political crisis in this country, our leaders have stood firm, our union has stood firm, and we're going to make another 25 years of history after this convention. So get ready, put on your hats, we're headed towards
Which side are you on? I wanna know now. Which side are you on? On the people's side. Which side are you on? Oh, you much too quiet. Which side are you? Let's do that chorus again. It was kind of tired. Which side are you on?
To lay the foundation for building a Southern Labor Alliance. We're not just here to have a pep talk. We're here to plan. We're here to talk about the challenges we have faced, to share lessons, and then to build forms that take us to the next level.
And I'm saying that we deserve the right to work too.
So my exclusion is not by a mishap. My exclusion is structural in nature. When you fill out your application, you will see it on your job application. You will see it on your housing application. You will see it in your school application. You will see it. And I want you to think about me when you see that. Because my kids deserve to eat too. My kids deserve to have medical too.
It's not about me going before those bosses. It's about teaching the workers to stand up and be leaders. You know, I know a lot of smart people down here, you know, and we got to teach people. Don't be afraid. Find what's inside of them that might be strong. They may not be the best speaker, okay? But they might be a person that might be willing to give their time to just passing out leaflets, giving that information out. It's about teaching people.
As far as repression intervention, the disruptor struggles, they try to intimidate you. Used to be if you filed a grievance, every supervisor in your office or your workplace will come and tell you, you better go take that back, because you're in serious trouble if you go forward. They found out not only are we going to file the grievance, we're going to fight them till we win.
All right. Workers want justice. Organize the South. Workers want justice. Organize the South. What? Workers want justice. Organize the South. Hey. Workers want power. Organize the South. Workers want power. Organize the South. Workers want power. Organize the South.
Good evening. My name is Shafia Mbalia, and I'm co-director of the Communiversity. We welcome you this evening to the 9th segment of the 9-part series of the Communiversity's webinar series on the Southern Workers Assembly, Southern Workers Power program. We are pleased with this series to celebrate 40 years of struggle by the Black workers for justice, 25 years of struggle by the United Electrical Workers Local 150, the North Carolina Public Service Workers Union, 10 years of the Southern Workers Assembly, and the inaugural year of the Communiversity. Tonight, part 9 is We Have a Right to Democracy. Therefore, we demand A, universal voting rights for all, with national standards, including automatic registration. B, a national holiday for Election Day. And C, an end to gerrymandering. We're pleased this evening to have 2 experts, 2 activists. I want to first introduce Brother Selwyn Carter. And Selwyn, you can come on up and turn your camera on.
I can't, the host, okay.
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 Selwyn Carter has over 35 years of experience in political campaigns and voting rights. For the past 25 years, he has played a leading role in the implementation of the AFL-CIO's political campaigns across the South. He has also served as a redistricting expert and organized large-scale voter registration and mobilization campaigns among voters of color. Also, this evening, Brother Devin Branch. Brother Devin Branch is a member of the Rebuild Collective, a new African independence movement formation committed to winning the struggle for an independent and socialist Republic of New Africa. Welcome, brothers. We are very glad to have you here this evening. What we're going to do is we're going to have each of you give about a 10-minute presentation, and then we're going to break. We have a cultural presentation by our fabulous, our sharp D. Noble coming out of Greensboro, North Carolina. And then after that poem, that spoken word that D. Noble brings us, we're going to come back and have a discussion. And we're going to just open that up. And we're going to then we'll be fielding questions from those of us who are on the chat line. We'll be pulling questions and comments from the chat line. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Brother Selwyn Carter to step forward and give us his words of wisdom. Selwyn?
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Let me just first say that my remarks are my own and not necessarily reflect the AFL-CIO's position. American democracy is in peril. For the past 50 years or so, progressive and leftist activists have not focused enough, in my opinion, on the central role of the African-American vote in the struggle for freedom. On top of that, Democrats and allied mainstream organizations invest too little and too late in educating, nurturing, and mobilizing the Black vote. However, voter turnout and the results of national elections from 2008 through 2020 have demonstrated the centrality of workers and communities of color to the preservation of American democracy. On the other hand, right-wing Republican leaders and their paramilitary allies are openly organizing and taking direct action to suppress electoral participation and the political power of African Americans in particular, and especially younger and less frequent voters among communities of color. While workers of color are the very groups directly targeted and threatened by the growing anti-democratic and right-wing activity and public policies, leftist and progressive activists and organizations have largely failed, in my opinion, to match the level of organization sophistication and effectiveness demonstrated by the right wing. And despite benefiting the most from the turnout of Black voters, Democrats seem reluctant to invest in unleashing the true power of a mobilized and educated African-American vote. One of the developments of most concern is the efforts by right-wing and anti-democratic forces within the US to use candidates of color and to recruit workers of color to their cause. A good example is the candidacy of Herschel Walker in Georgia in the US Senate race. These efforts are worthy of our attention. Earlier this year, legislators in at least 27 states introduced 96 bills that would make it harder to vote in 12 states. If enacted, these bills would disproportionately impact voters of color. The events of January 6, 2021, and the subsequent widespread efforts to subvert elections and to enact legislation to restrict and discourage voters of color from voting should be considered as a fundamental threat to the freedom of African American and other voters of color. The failure of the US Congress to pass significant pieces of legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Police Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 has further dampened the enthusiasm for voting among communities of color and younger voters. The attack on women by the right wing and the Supreme Court further underscores the threat faced by working people and opens up further possibilities for expanded coalition building. However, there's a historical context to the right-wing violence and intimidation we are facing now, and that history is a crucial part of the education for both progressive activists and for communities of color. If we don't understand that history, we won't get our strategy right today. What happened in the American South following the passage of the 14th and the 15th Amendments is the key to understanding all of the subsequent and current efforts by white Americans to restrict the voting rights of African Americans. It also explains why so much effort and resources over the years have been devoted to confusing the African American community about whether it should vote. This confusion extends to African American progressive and leftist activists. Following the passage of the 15th Amendment African American political representation in the South skyrocketed. Between 1870 and 1900, 22 African Americans served in the US Congress. Before, there had been none. However, the fact that was the scariest of all the Southern whites is that in the state legislature of South Carolina, Blacks outnumbered whites by 87 to 40, more than 2 to 1. All total, over 2,000 African Americans, that's 2,000, held public office at this time. Black people held conventions and organized leagues for equal rights. So exactly how did voting benefit African Americans during Reconstruction? Well, African Americans became postmasters, sheriffs, mayors, coroners, police chiefs, representatives in state legislatures, lieutenant governors in the South, Speaker of the House, state commissioners, superintendents of education, members of Congress, and the US Senate. African Americans sought their own employment. Voting resulted in African American self-government. Southern whites were so threatened by African American self-government that they resorted to terrorism to reinstall white supremacy. This is the key point that progressive and leftist activists need to focus on. The key factor which led to the reversal of African American voting rights was that African Americans had begun to practice American democracy and self-government in the South. African Americans had elected candidates of their own choosing and started to make decisions about their own schooling, healthcare, economic life, and social welfare. This exercise of African American democracy and voting rights was stopped through the enactment of a number of laws to reverse the gains made by Blacks and by violence when those laws were not enough. 7 Southern states enacted grandfather clauses to revoke the right guaranteed to African Americans by the 15th Amendment. These clauses allowed anyone who had been granted the right to vote before 1867 to continue voting, but imposed barriers for African Americans who had been enslaved before that time. Southern whites were therefore grandfathers. By 1901, George Henry White of North Carolina left as the last African American in the United States Congress. George White's words from his 1899 speech to Congress are worth remembering. He said, "Our ratio of representation is poor. We have kept quiet, while numerically and justly we are entitled to 51 members of this House, and I am the only one left." And in his final speech in 1901, he said, "This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again." It would take Black voters in the South 72 years after George White to elect a representative of their choice to the US Congress. Between 1946 and 1966, at least 16 people were murdered in connection with voter registration drives in the South. 9 of them were in Mississippi. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we all talk about, was necessary so that African Americans could realize the exact same rights that had been granted to them 95 years earlier by the passage of the 15th Amendment. In Mississippi, just to illustrate, following the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Black voter registration increased from 25,000 in 1965 to 250,000 in 1966. And the percentage of registered Blacks in Texas increased from 34.9% in 1960 to 84.7% in 1970. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, therefore, initially succeeded in removing most of the barriers which prevented Blacks in the South from registering and from voting. However, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, it would take another 22 years, 2 amendments, vigorous litigation, and federal government intervention before the opportunity for African Americans to elect a congressional representative became a reality in most of the Southern states. Okay. Prior to the 1990 census, there were 205 African American state legislators in 11 Southern states. 157 of state house members and 48 state senators. By 1994, as a result of challenges and amendments to the Voting Rights Act, 207 African American state house members and 64 state senators had been elected. And let me say this, I was directly involved in this work. Plus an additional 54 majority Black districts had been created, but had retained or elected white incumbents. And prior to 1990, before the census, only 5 southern states had elected African Americans to Congress. However, by 92, after applying the 1982 amendments, the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act and the new census, the number of congressional Black caucus members from the South jumped from 5 to 17. 3 each were from Georgia and Florida, 2 each from North Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas, and 1 each from Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act, has been referred to as a tool meant to ensure that the second Reconstruction of the 1960s was not gutted like the first Reconstruction of the 1860s and the 1870s. And today's white backlash is reminiscent of the white backlash that ended the first Reconstruction, and it is a serious threat to the progress and empowerment achieved by African Americans and other communities of color since the Voting Rights Act. The common thread that threatened white America in both periods is the large-scale mobilization of Black voters and today other voters of color. The mobilization of African American and other voters of color that led to the election and the re-election of the first African American president, Barack Obama, was a repeat of the events which occurred following the large-scale mobilization of Black voters and the election of 2,000 Black office holders during Reconstruction in the South. The lesson for progressive and leftist activists is that the Black vote is the key, and it is where they should focus almost all of their energies. In America, why? Voting decides everything. Voting decides who controls the police, who picks judges, who sends people to prison, who gets quality health care, whether women get to control their own bodies, who offers incentives for businesses to build in communities, who spends tax money, who protects your children at school, who decides school budgets and curriculum. The efforts of progressive activists should be focused on educating African American non-voters and infrequent voters into understanding that if they choose not to vote, other people will choose the officials who make the decisions that control their lives. Furthermore, if they voted in one election like 2020, but didn't get all the things they were hoping for, like the George Floyd Justice and Police Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, then the solution is not to stop voting, it is rather the exact opposite. The solution is to volunteer to help get more people from their communities to vote and elect more representatives who think like them and who share their priorities. In other words, if they vote more, they have more power. History has shown that the most radical action to take against the American system of oppression and exploitation is to educate, agitate, and mobilize millions of African Americans to participate as equals in that system. Between 1876 and 1900, that participation by African Americans as equals so scared and threatened the white Southern oppressive class that they resorted to legislation and violence to prevent African Americans from voting. African American political representation was reduced from 2,000 to virtually none. Today, the white MAGA Republicans have made a decision, and that decision is that they do not want to share power in coalition with African Americans and communities of color. Like their predecessors in the Southern slave owning class, they are resorting to legislation and violence to achieve their objectives. Communities of color have been the primary target of this voter disenfranchisement and election subversion. They should be the targets of a unified strategy by progressive activists and organizations. And I'm just about done. But what should that strategy be? A principal strategy of progressive activists should be to build a broad national coalition to oppose the forward march towards US fascism. In order to accomplish this, much work needs to be done to build, nurture, and maintain strategic partnerships with progressive constituencies and coalitions and organizations at the local, state, and national level, helping to forge the building of a national progressive front or strategic coalition to oppose fascism in the US and to strengthen the organizational capacity of community-based organizations to educate, to agitate, and to organize communities of color at the local, state, and national levels to resist and to build effective political power. Thank you.
Thank you, Selwyn. I think there's a lot for us to chew on. There's a lot for us to chew on. And I think we're going to use that as that meat to chew on and to transition both to Brother Devin. And I think we're going to have a very lively discussion after Brother D. Noble renders the cultural part. Brother Devin, why don't you come on and join us?
Right on. That was a great historical overview by Brother Selwyn. And I think it's important to note that right now I'm a resident of Mississippi, and right now in the South, we are still confronting the neo-Confederate power structure that was erected in the aftermath of the overthrow of Reconstruction in 1877, which the brother talked about. And that neo-Confederate power structure has held power without interruption in states like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and South Carolina and Georgia. And since then, and it continues to hold power today. And that neo-Confederate power structure, as some of us, including those of us in the Rebuild Collective, which is a new African independence movement organization fighting both for national independence and socialism, we have identified 3 pillars of power upon which this neo-Confederate power structure rests. And that is the national oppression of New African people or Black people in the South, and also the First Nations people, as in Mississippi, for instance, the Choctaw people, though they have nominal, or people talk about them having some degree of self-determination. Reservation is not a self-governing entity, so they still live under American domination. They are not free in any way or self-determining peoples. So the national oppression of New African and First Nations peoples, the oppression of women, and the naked dictatorship of capital, which subjugates labor in the South, which has since the beginning of our presence here, enslavement, and still does today. And the South has always been the bastion of anti-labor organizing, and many industries have begun to pop up in the South as a consequence of their efforts to flee the organized labor force of the North. And so we have still the fight for democracy to wage. And I think this pillar, this part of the program of the Southern Workers Assembly, speaking of the right to democracy and the demand for universal voting rights for all, with national standards, including automatic registration, a national paid holiday for election day, and an end to gerrymandering, is an essential portion of the struggle to break the back of neo-Confederate power. But that we also must step beyond that as well and fight for the restoration, for instance, of the right to vote for those who have been incarcerated or are currently incarcerated or who are under court supervision. So for instance, in the Deep South, and many states of the Deep South, and in Mississippi, you could lose your voting right permanently by being convicted of certain felonies. Whereas in Maine and Vermont, which are 2 of the whitest states in the country, you have a permanent right to vote. You do not lose your right to vote in Maine and Vermont. You can vote in prison in Maine and Vermont. But in places in the South, like Texas and Mississippi, in Texas in particular, there was a sister, Crystal Mason, who was sentenced to 5 years to prison for voting while on parole, whereas she could have been convicted of murder and in prison in Maine or Vermont and voted in prison, post-conviction. And right now in places like Mississippi, in Mississippi, 1 in 6 New African, 1 in 6 Black adults in Mississippi, that's more than 200,000 people, cannot vote because they have been disenfranchised as a consequence of laws barring people who have certain convictions from voting. That is a sizable section of a population that's only a few million. And that is larger than the deciding number of votes in several local and state elections. So we have to challenge those, we have to challenge those in our community One of the things that Selwyn mentioned was that there are people who are encouraging our people not to vote, or who are saying that voting is of no consequence and has never done anything to empower our communities. Now, I think it was important that he mentioned how much power our people gained during the period of radical Reconstruction. But there are even contemporary examples of how working class New African communities exercising their right to vote, even in minority conditions, has improved their situation in measurable ways. And I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. That's where I was born and raised. And Cleveland, Ohio was a city that elected the first Black mayor of any major city, Carl Stokes, in 1967. And in 1968, there was a rebellion in Cleveland. And during that rebellion, and it was the only rebellion during that period where there were more white casualties and police casualties than there were casualties of the working class Black community in which the rebellion took place. 16 police were shot, several of them fatally. Only 4 brothers were shot, 3 of them died. The police were inclined, having suffered a major humiliation and a defeat on the battlefield, to retaliate on the broader Black community of Cleveland. Carl Stokes, however, ordered the withdrawal of all white police from the Glenville area, which prevented a massacre of the population. And this was at a time when Cleveland was only 35% Black. His election was made possible only through a broad coalition of both a small progressive white population and a massive broad coalition among the Black population, which included not just the middle class Black population, but was rooted in the working class Black population of Cleveland and the nationalist movement as well, who actually actively encouraged people to participate in that election. So that was a concrete benefit, the lack of retaliation, the ordering of white police out of a Black community in 1968 by a mayor who was elected only because of the maximum voting participation of our community. But there have been other impacts in the South. For instance, in Houston, Texas, in Harris County, where I lived and worked for a progressive nonprofit organization that helped make bail reform possible in Harris County. There were hundreds of thousands of people who have been stuck in jails across this country. Right now, there are 500,000 people today sitting in jails across this country, not because they have been convicted of anything, but because they don't have $50 or $500 or $1,000 to purchase their freedom. Many of these people for misdemeanor charges. So we were able to end the bail system for most misdemeanor charges in Harris County. That meant hundreds of thousands of people who would otherwise have been in prison, especially during a global pandemic, in the county jail, did not have to stay in that jail because people were elected who had promised and carried out that promise to change the cash bail system. And this is of extreme consequence, and to belittle the impact that these things can have is really a crime against the Black working class and other peoples who are struggling. Now, it is not a panacea, and it won't resolve instantly every single problem that we have, any more than going to the gym one day will change your health situation. It takes more than just a vote, but we cannot move forward without a vote. And central to this struggle for democracy in the South is not just the expansion of the voting right. In many ways, the expansion of voting rights and other rights that we need in the South will be achieved with the growth of workplace democracy. Because as Saladin mentioned in the videos that were shown, the workers are disempowered to engage fully as political beings in the South because their bosses historically and right now fire them for engaging in actions that are contrary to the belief of the bosses and the perspective of the bosses. And workers have demonstrated, and organized trade unions have demonstrated how powerful they can be in standing against the efforts of voter suppression. In fact, in Texas, during the previous legislative session, when some of the most reactionary voting laws in the country were passed, the organization that was at the forefront of resisting that was the Communication Workers of America. And they were able to do that, including people who worked for AT&T, picketing outside of AT&T stores and demanding from the leadership and management of AT&T to stop investing in those candidates who are supporting voter suppression. They would not have been able to even contemplate that without fearing for their jobs had they not been organized. So they were empowered not just to fight for their rights in the workplace, which is an essential aspect of organizing labor, but to transcend that narrow trade unionism and utilize their trade union as a vehicle to struggle for their rights as people in their communities and for the rights of other oppressed working class people. And so we must fight for the expansion of political democracy in the South, the right to vote. But we have to understand that an essential pillar of the coalition that we will need to be successful in the broader struggles for the liberation of the South is an organized New African working class, organized to engage in political struggle also at the point of production. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you. I think we've got a very unique program today, talking about the duality of struggles against capital, as well as the fight for power at the local to the international, to the national level. But before we get into the discussion, we're gonna welcome our brother D. Noble. As usual, he comes with some powerful words, and I'm sure that it's gonna connect up with us today. D?
Within the throes of this rotten two-party system, both liberals and conservatives serve tyrannical capitalism. So what does it mean to vote when you have rightfully lost the audacity of hope and which boss you elect to let grip your throat? When Republicans and Democrats represent two sides of the same foul coin, and we see that politically they are conjoined at the hip with corporate interests that amplify our suffering, why would workers talk about suffrage? We demand universal voting rights for the toiling masses because we believe in the need to organize our interests as a class. We refuse to concede the task of securing our very existence and guaranteeing the bright futures of our children to the monstrous machinations of the state that, if left unchecked, would serve us on a gilded plate to be fed to oligarchs with appetites that are ravenous. We refuse to be the food of their insatiable avarice. So we demand the right to fight and confront the state, not just as singular voters going through the motions of 2- and 4-year rituals, not as individuals doped up on slanderous commercials and reality TV propaganda, but as an informed class putting forth our own answers to the problems we face, to the misery and suffering we will erase, to the violent contradictions we will expose and break, by forming our own independent revolutionary political third party that will overthrow today's oligarchies by organizing a militant platform and campaign that we can win through the clarity and vision embodied in our demands, through the political education and class consciousness achieved through our rigorous debates about the limitations of the status quo state and what we must do to assert real people power and create real democracy, and how we fight in the interim at our workplaces, at our schools, and in the voting booth till we transform the world under the strength and power of our organized truth.
So we want to get folks together. We want to thank D. Noble again. Again, we're raising the questions. I think we have a serious political situation on our hands. As Brother Selwyn has pointed out, there's rising fascism, authoritarianism, violent attacks that have gone announced and unannounced across the country. And it is incumbent on us through organization to address those questions. So I put a question in the chat I'd like Selwyn to start out with. And can you speak, Selwyn, to the significance of the lack of local emphasis by the major political parties for the potential political power at the local level of Black and working class communities?
Yes.
You see all this, president, vote for me, vote for the president, but no one ever speaks about those positions that you outlined so clearly in your presentation: coroners, postmasters, health commissioners, zoning, all of those things. Can you speak to that?
Sure. And first, let me say that currently in this present time, right-wing Republicans are in fact doing their due diligence base building at the local level. In Florida, where I live, for example, they're moving to determine what you can teach in school, okay? And any attempt to teach the history of oppression is outright being forbidden, because you're being told that you can't teach anything that makes people feel bad. But what they're doing now is moving to the school board, which is a very important layer of local political power. And what you see is right-wing activists organizing slates of candidates to take effective control of school boards, okay? Often we focus on the high office and we miss the fruit that's low-hanging right in front of us. And you have to build in stages. And I contend that, in this juncture, African-American activists need to look at where the masses of our people are. You see, the point about organizing electorally is not about the two major political parties. It is in fact about our people. And it's about learning the history and the lessons from Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. There's a reason why we've been taught so much that we should not encourage African Americans to register and to vote. And that reason, as I pointed out in my presentation, goes to the history of the success that we had at the local level in building political power and allowing African Americans to exercise decision-making over many aspects of their life, okay? And I contend that right now we are ill-equipped to compete and to confront what's coming at us. We have to realize that it's only a fluke that led to January 6th not being successful. Right. If January 6th had been successful, okay, then what would have happened? Okay, a government that came to power illegally, the first thing that it would have done is take steps to make sure that it can't be threatened. And the first order of business will be to silence all organizations that have the capacity to threaten their existence. And people like the general, what's his name, Michael Flynn, a guy who is professed and clear, who first of all had a background in defense intelligence and subversion internationally, and has professed that he's ready to use the military domestically, okay, he would have been elevated to a position of power, okay? And someone like that, charged with the responsibility of preserving a government that came to power illegally, okay, our reality would be quite different. And it's quite possible that we could face that reality very soon. We could face it in 2 years, or even in less than 2 years, if these fools take over control of the US Congress, move immediately towards efforts to impeach and delegitimize the current people who are in power, and we could descend into a no man's land very quickly. My point is that we are not organized right now to handle that. If those moves towards fascism manifest themselves very soon in the United States of America, the progressive African-American activists are not organized, and more importantly, we don't have the relationships with our people. We haven't done the analysis of the organizations at the local and state level that connect with our people in the churches and the communities. We don't know who the leaders are. We don't have their cell phone number. We don't have a network to communicate with them.
So Selwyn, let me jump in here and let me bring Devin in. And I want to ask him just related to that. He talked earlier about having been a part of, in our conversation prior to, of being part of Communications Workers of America. And he talked about workers' organizations at the point of production. What role do you see workers' organizations, unions in the South, for example, such as UE 150, the North Carolina Public Service Workers Union, playing in fighting for working class programs and counteracting these kinds of the push that Selwyn is talking about, not only in terms of telling folks not to vote, but coming up with programs such as and fighting for programs such as this 9-point program that they have come up with through the Southern Workers Assembly. What do you see the role of working class organizations and unions?
I think the role of working class organizations across the South, on even a multinational basis, though in many states of the South, especially the Southeast, it is the new African population that is the central part of that working class that will struggle for liberation but there are states like Texas, for instance, where it is essential that there is a multinational working class struggle, where the growing new majority in Texas is going to be a Latino population. And the Black and Latino population, our population in conjunction with the working class Chicano and other Latino communities, will be essential to overturning neo-Confederate power in Texas. And Texas in many ways is like the linchpin of the entire neo-Confederate power structure. And when it goes, it weakens everything else. Also, if you look at the largest immigration raids, the largest raids against undocumented workers in the history of the United States, the two largest, unless they just did another one, who knows, they may be doing one right now somewhere, but have been not in California or Texas, but in the state of Mississippi. And that is for a reason. In Mississippi, they don't play about passionate conservatism. It is naked white supremacy. That's what it has been since the foundation of that state. That's what it is today. And it was to teach that undocumented population a lesson. Don't even think about organizing. We need you. And we will keep enough of you here to continue the essential work that you are doing for our economy. But we will from time to time whip you to keep you terrified, to prevent you from even thinking about organizing indefinitely, thinking about linking up with the Black folks in Mississippi and uniting to struggle for your rights and the rights of workers in the South. And then there are some direct ways that workers and unions can participate in struggle. During the summer of the George Floyd demonstrations in Dallas, Texas, for instance, there were so many people involved in the protest activities that the police could not arrest them using their cars and transport them to the jail. They had to actually use municipal buses to do so. But some of us who had some connection to the unions there reached out to the union of the transportation workers and said, hey, will you tell your workers not to drive those buses? Stop driving those people to jail. And they agree, and they did that. And they stopped picking those people up. And then that led to more pressure on others, including the district attorney who had been elected in Dallas County, to not prosecute a lot of people. But they cannot uphold their power. They cannot uphold their system without the active collaboration of working class people. And if workers withdraw their cooperation, that system collapses. And it is only at that point of production, especially now. Right now, New African people in Mississippi are a minority, large minority, but still a minority. And we are marginalized economically, but we are central to the economy of Mississippi. The workers at Nissan are central to the functioning of that plant. The postal workers are almost universally working class Black people, New African people in Mississippi. So it is the working class that makes the world go round, and denying, even if you are not the majority, having the lever of the ability to shut down production, to shut down essential service, if the rights of your people continue to be abused, is going to be essential to us winning the rights that we are struggling for right now, such as even the right to decent drinking water in places like Jackson, Mississippi. We went 2 months without drinking water in the capital city of the state of Mississippi. 2 months. And we can protest that. And there have been some protests, some Moral Monday demonstrations involving the Poor People's Campaign, and that is good. And that must expand. But we will have to do more activities, and there will have to be labor action to really force them to their knees with respect to these issues.
Chef, if I could jump in real quick on that point, I think, we also need to work with AFL-CIO constituency groups like the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and other groups of that nature. These are union groups that work with Black workers to specifically, I would say, train about a minimum of 350 activists at the local level. First, we need to train them in some specific skills, how to run a phone bank, how to do a direct mail campaign, a door-to-door canvassing campaign, and a GOTV, or get out the vote canvassing operation, in terms of being able to move the Black community at the local level to compete at the school board and some of the other local elections we talked about earlier. And the training of these activists is important for another reason. It helps us to build a cadre of people who can address what Brother D talked about, which is the accountability aspect, because he's right. Just engaging in electoral action by itself may not be effective if you don't have a strategy to hold the people who get elected as a result of your efforts accountable. And we can't hold them accountable if we don't have a core of trained leadership at the young leaders at the local level who can engage in digital action and grassroots lobbying and other kinds of tactics to make sure that at the city council, county commission, and school board level, as well as the state legislature, they move to roll back decisions like those decisions around what you can teach in school, etc.
So,
right on. May I ask?
So forward, for example, so that's where the Southern Workers Assembly, the Workers' Power Program, could come in and to do the kinds of training, not only on these questions about the electoral strategy, but also the political points, the political strategy, and how to help workers translate that to their local level, right?
Right on.
And show how that connects across the South. Were there, but by the way, Devin, were there actions, or have there been actions, or is there work at Jackson, at the local level in Jackson, where there's solidarity with any of the unions or workers' organizations there?
Not right now around the water crisis. I think that is an essential next step to be taken in this process, and as well as the expansion, like Selwyn mentioned, of these organizations. In places like Mississippi, we need things like the Black Workers for Justice in Mississippi. We need to raise the history of revolutionary unionism among New African people, like things like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Black Workers Congress. People need to know that our people have organized on a revolutionary basis at the point of production and made and won victories, achieved historical things. So I do think, and that point about the local level is so critical. And it's not just about who you can elect. In East Cleveland, Ohio, a poor New African community, 95% Black with a $16,000 median income, they have organized a successful recall election to remove a mayor and a council president. They didn't have to vote for anybody. They didn't have to choose the lesser of two evils. They were able to hold a corrupt leadership accountable and remove them from office. And that's essential.
Let me jump in on Mississippi for a minute, because I've done a lot of work in Mississippi over the last 3 decades. I've been down there quite a bit, and Mississippi and the water crisis offers a very real example to expose the hypocrisy of the right-wing Republicans. Let me say what I mean. These people have been preaching at the local level, in the state level, about how anti-federal government they are and how it is not correct to accept federal money. Yet what we found out, as we saw with the scandal with that football player who stole the welfare money to build a stadium in honor of his daughter, what we found out is that they've been stealing the money that was earmarked for poor Black people to help them, and they've been using that money illegally. Now, when it comes to the water in particular, the water situation in Mississippi is downright criminal, because they have taken the federal money that was geared to help the city of Jackson, and they have directed it to the parts of Mississippi where white people live, and the same people who vote against the federal government. They've gotten the federal money, and the city of Jackson, where that money was intended to help address the chronic problems with the water system in Jackson that have existed for decades, Jackson has been starved out because the white reactionary Republicans, they want to basically prove that a Black governing over the city of Jackson has not worked. So they've deliberately tried to cripple the city of Jackson and make it look incompetent, while they've stolen the money that was meant for Jackson and given it to white Mississippi.
And you can trace that has happened to local Black communities across the South. It happened in Whitaker's, North Carolina, Fremont, North Carolina, Birmingham, Alabama. All of that has been documented. But what I'd like to do is to take us to go, let's go back to this question of accountability. Mm-hmm. Why don't we step to the next level when we talk about accountability, not only recall, but local independent organization that's led by workers with a working class program that Meredith goes out in the street and it speaks to the kinds of issues that are as important to working class and Black working class communities, such as water, such as utilities, such as the pollution, such as gentrification. How can we begin to engage workers' organizations into the community and start building local political independent organizations led by working class organizations, engage the unions in those organizations, so that questions such as solidarity with workers who are doing union drives and vice versa can be activated and mobilized.
The first step is investigation. There's an old saying, no investigation, no right to speak. Okay, and we need to use online research and other tools to map local communities. We need to map the religious institutions, the community service organizations, and the local leaders and activists, and build a database, okay, of who is who and where they are. That's the first step. You can't really put together an accountability strategy unless you know who exists in the community. And we haven't done that work. So once you map the community and you have an understanding of the organizational structure, the community, and the leadership structure, and who speaks to these community organizations and these churches, then we can come back and sort of plot that out around the table and figure out what we have. And then we can move forward to organize. After we've collected the contact information for these people, we can begin to organize some coalition meetings with the various leaders and community organizations, virtually to start, to begin to collect some intelligence on what the major issues are that their membership and their constituencies are concerned about. okay? And from that basis, we would then be empowered to build an accountability strategy, because first we would know whom we're talking to, and next we would know what issues the people that they represent care about.
So
And then also, I think we
go ahead.
that we have to also just go into the communities themselves and do the old door-to-door talking to our folks and holding community meetings of working class Black people, asking them what the main issues are, getting them to actively participate in the decision-making processes of the campaign for resistance against these things, but then ultimately speaking, not just preparing them, yes, to help engage in electoral politics, but not just to elect other people, but to develop leadership among that are indigenous to the working class community that can govern.
Right, now we're on the same page, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Let me cut through here, because there's also developing across the South a people's what I call people's democracy organizations called assemblies. There's an assembly process that's happening. The Southern Workers Assembly is one that is targeted across the region and toward workers. But there's also parallel to that at the local level, and beginning to do the exact things that you're talking about, Selwyn, and of investigation. But you have, for example, in North Carolina, you have the New Bern People's Assembly. In Thursday, there's going to be the Triangle Workers Assembly meeting, and they have been engaged with other organizations in looking at the budget, the city budget of Raleigh, and doing the kind of door-to-door work that you're talking about. There's also the Charlotte Assembly that's developing, and you have that in other places in other cities. So when we talk about what's not happening, let's also do the investigation and figure out how we begin, or how do we connect up with those forces who are beginning to connect both the community-wide assembly process that's happening across the South, as well as in connecting it with the Southern Workers Assembly that are building local workers assemblies that are looking at both the economic questions as well as the political questions.
That's important. Like North Carolina has a statewide A. Philip Randolph Institute. Okay, it's a mass organization that's a constituency group of the AFL-CIO. But the reason I mentioned the investigation is that my own view right now is no one organization that I'm aware of has enough capacity at the local level to do what's necessary among our people. That's why my proposal is that we do the outreach, because we need to network. There are lots of organizations out there that mean well that we don't have contact with, and we need to multiply our forces. And the best way to do that is to find out those community groups and church groups that are out there and connect with them and offer them a program of action. Okay, the training is an example of some stuff we can unite them around. So, and by doing the networking and the research, we can broaden our efforts, because it will be a mistake for us to, no matter how well intentioned we are, it will be a mistake for us to just move forward with our own formations as if we speak for the entire communities, because we don't. There's too many groups out there that we don't have contact with right now.
And I'll let that be your closing, because we've got to wrap this up. And Devin, I want to give you a last word to wrap up on your comments for this evening. I appreciate both of you comrades coming in and laying out some concrete work that has been happening, organizing that's happening, and things and directions for us to go. Devin, would you like to?
Sure, I would just like to second what Selman was saying. Like it is essential that we expand a regional network of people, working class folks struggling, because there are several effectively micro organizations. And without the independent power to move the kind of change that we need, there has to be a regional working class network that leads this change. And we need to not just organize a network, but they need to be carrying out a strategic plan. That we cannot haphazardly, we can no more haphazardly overthrow neo-Confederate power than an army can haphazardly engage in warfare. There has to be a plan. And we have to understand that that plan is it's going to require amending in the course of struggle. But without a broader network and without a strategic plan that's rooted in winning actual victories and not just showing our opposition in protest, then we will not be able to move forward. So I would just like to thank you all for holding this. I would really like to thank you, Shafia, the Black Workers for Justice, and Brother Selwyn for sharing the information that he shared that laid a broader historical context for what has happened.
Yeah, and Shafi, before we go, I don't know if you saw, there's a question from Menelik Vandermeer. I'd like to address that very briefly before we end, if you don't mind.
Devin? Okay.
His question is, what should be our priority as we move forward in addressing the urgency of Black workers to combat the assault by neoconservatives and the state? I spoke to that in the very end of my presentation, where I said that a principal strategy of progressive activists should be to build a broad national coalition to oppose the march towards fascism in the US. And that's where I call for, building and nurturing and maintaining strategic partnerships with progressive constituencies and community organizations at the local, state, and national levels to forge a strategic front to oppose fascism, because this here is going to be a struggle that is going to define the next period. The right wing is not going to stop because they're threatened by the emergence of people of color in what they see as the new majority. And they don't have any place to go. They're not going to leave America and go anywhere else. So the only solution for them, in their perspective, is to prevent us from achieving any semblance of power. And so unless we build a front of people of color and progressive forces, we're not going to be able to stand up against them. I hope I answered the question.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, brothers, again. This will not be the last time. This will not be the last word on this important topic. We will be organizing future programs around this. Thank you and good night.
Good night.